The phone rang, sharp and insistent, cutting through the quiet hum of the car. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw her mother's name. Something felt off. Her mother never called during her trips unless it was urgent. "Hello," she answered, her voice trembling slightly. The silence on the other end was heavy, suffocating. Then her mother's voice broke through, raw and broken. "It's your father. He's gone." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. Her grip on the phone tightened, her vision blurring as the world around her seemed to collapse. "What do you mean he's gone? What happened?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. Her mother's sobs were the only response. The details didn't matter in that moment. All she knew was that her father, the man who had always been her rock, was no longer there. The car felt too small, the air too thin. She couldn't breathe. "I'm coming home," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She ended the call and stared out the window, the scenery blurring as tears streamed down her face. Her mind raced, replaying memories of her father, his laughter, his advice, the way he always knew how to make everything better. But this time, he couldn't fix this. He was gone. The driver, sensing her distress, asked if she was okay. She nodded numbly, unable to form words. Her thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind of grief and disbelief. How could this happen? He was fine when she left. He had waved her off with a smile, telling her to enjoy her trip. And now, he was gone. As the car sped toward home, she felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness, anger, and an overwhelming sense of emptiness. But beneath it all, there was a nagging feeling, a tiny voice in the back of her mind whispering that something wasn't right. She pushed it away, blaming it on the shock of the news. Little did she know that feeling was the first hint of the storm that was about to unravel her family's world. The house was eerily quiet when she arrived, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the hallway. The familiar scent of her father's cologne lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of his presence that was no longer there. Her mother sat on the couch, her face pale and eyes swollen from crying. She looked up, her expression a mix of relief and despair, as if she had been waiting for someone to share the weight of her grief. They embraced, holding on to each other tightly, as if they could somehow keep the world from falling apart. "What happened?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother hesitated, her hands trembling as she wiped her tears. "It was sudden. A heart attack. He was gone before the ambulance even arrived." The words felt like a knife twisting in her chest. A heart attack? Her father had always been healthy, active. He had no history of heart problems. It didn't make sense. But before she could voice her doubts, her brother walked in, his face grim and his shoulders slumped. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and serious. There was something in his tone that made her stomach churn. It wasn't just grief. It was something darker, something she couldn't quite place. They gathered in the living room, the air thick with tension. Her brother paced back and forth, his hands clenched into fists. "There's something you need to know," he began, his voice shaking. "Dad, he wasn't who we thought he was." She stared at him, confusion and fear swirling inside her. "What are you talking about?" He took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for what he was about to say. "I found something in his office. Papers, documents, things that don't add up. Dad had secrets. Big ones." Her mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "No, that's not possible. Your father was an honest man. He wouldn't—" "I thought so too," her brother interrupted, his voice rising. "But the evidence is right there. I don't know what it all means yet, but we need to find out." She felt like the ground was slipping out from under her. First the shock of her father's death, and now this? Secrets? What kind of secrets could he possibly have? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but the pieces didn't fit. "Show me," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Her brother nodded and led the way to their father's office. The room was just as he had left it, neat, organized, and filled with the familiar scent of old books and coffee. But now it felt foreign, like a place she no longer knew. Her brother opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of papers, spreading them out on the desk. She leaned in, her eyes scanning the documents. Bank statements, legal papers, letters, and then she saw it. A name she didn't recognize, an address in another city, and a photo of her father with a woman she had never seen before. Her heart pounded in her chest as she picked up the photo, her hands trembling. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Her brother shook his head. "I don't know, but it looks like Dad had another life, one we knew nothing about." The room spun around her as the weight of his words sank in. Her father, the man she had trusted and loved her entire life, had been living a double life? It was impossible. And yet the evidence was right in front of her. As she stared at the photo, a flood of emotions washed over her. Anger, betrayal, confusion, and a deep, aching sadness. But beneath it all, there was a burning need to know the truth. Whatever her father had been hiding, she was determined to uncover it. The days that followed were a blur. The funeral arrangements were made in a haze of grief and confusion, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about the photo, the documents, and the secrets her father had taken to his grave. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, smiling, laughing, the way he had always been. But now that image was tainted by the shadow of doubt. Her brother had taken charge of the investigation, determined to uncover the truth. He spent hours in their father's office, poring over every document, every piece of paper, looking for clues. She joined him whenever she could, her heart heavy, but her resolve unwavering. They had to know. They owed it to themselves, to their mother, and even to their father to find out what he had been hiding. One evening, as they sat surrounded by stacks of papers, her brother let out a frustrated sigh. "There's too much here," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Bank accounts, property deeds, letters, but nothing that ties it all together. It's like he wanted to keep us guessing." She picked up a letter, her eyes scanning the words. It was addressed to her father, but the name at the top wasn't his. It was the same name they had seen on the other documents. The name of the woman in the photo. The letter was brief, just a few lines, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. "We need to find her," she said suddenly, her voice firm. "This woman, she's the key. If anyone knows what Dad was hiding, it's her." Her brother nodded, his expression grim. "I've been thinking the same thing. But how do we find her? We don't even know her full name." She held up the letter, pointing to the return address. "We start here." The address led them to a small town a few hours away. They decided to go together, leaving their mother at home. She was still in shock, still unable to process everything that was happening. They didn't want to burden her with more uncertainty, not until they had answers. The drive was quiet, the weight of their mission hanging heavy in the air. Neither of them spoke much, each lost in their own thoughts. She stared out the window, her mind racing with questions. Who was this woman? What was her connection to their father? And why had he kept her a secret? When they finally arrived, the town was just as they had imagined. Small, quiet, and unassuming. They found the address easily enough, a modest house on a tree-lined street. It looked ordinary, but to them it felt like the gateway to a world they had never known. They parked the car and sat for a moment, gathering their courage. "Are you ready?" her brother asked, his voice low. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Let's do this." They walked up to the door and knocked, their hearts pounding in unison. For a moment, there was no response. Then the door creaked open, and a woman appeared. She was older with kind eyes and a gentle smile. But when she saw them, her expression changed. Shock, recognition, and something else they couldn't quite place. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She exchanged a glance with her brother, then stepped forward. "We're looking for someone," she said, holding up the photo. "Do you know this man?" The woman's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the photo. "Yes," she whispered. "That's my husband." The words hit them like a thunderclap. Her brother staggered back, his face pale. She felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. Her father, this woman's husband. It was impossible, and yet the truth was staring them in the face. "I think you'd better come inside," the woman said softly, stepping aside to let them in. They followed her into the house, their minds reeling. The living room was cozy, filled with photos and mementos. But one photo in particular caught her eye, a picture of her father, smiling, with his arm around the woman. It was a side of him she had never seen, a life she had never known. The woman gestured for them to sit, then took a deep breath. "I suppose you have a lot of questions," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "And I'll answer them as best as I can. But first, you need to know this. Your father loved you. More than anything. Whatever he did it to protect you." She felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked at the woman. "Protect us from what?" The woman hesitated, then sighed. "From the truth, and from the people who would do anything to keep it hidden." The woman introduced herself as Clara. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a mix of sorrow and resignation, as if she had been waiting for this moment for years. She gestured for them to sit, and they did, their eyes never leaving her face. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the weight of her words settled over them. "Your father and I met many years ago," Clara began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "He was different then. Younger, of course, but also burdened by something he could never fully explain. He told me he had a family, but he said it was complicated. I didn't ask too many questions. I loved him, and that was enough." She paused, her gaze drifting to the photo on the mantel, the one of her and their father. "We built a life here quietly. He would come and go, always saying it was for work. I never doubted him, not until—" Her voice trailed off, and she took a deep breath before continuing. "Not until I found out the truth." "What truth?" her brother asked, his voice sharp with impatience. "What was he hiding?" Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with a sadness that made her heart ache. "Your father wasn't just a businessman. He was involved in something much bigger, much darker. I don't know all the details, he kept most of it from me, but I know it had to do with money, power, and people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets." She felt a chill run down her spine. "Are you saying he was involved in something illegal?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but he wasn't a bad man. He got caught up in something he couldn't escape. He told me once that he made a mistake, a long time ago, and it cost him everything. He tried to make it right, but by then, it was too late." Her brother leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the couch. "What kind of mistake? What did he do?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know. He never told me the specifics. But I do know this. He was afraid. Afraid for himself, for me, and for you. That's why he kept us separate. He thought it would protect us." She felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Protect us from what? Who was he afraid of?" Clara's expression darkened. "There are people out there, powerful people, who don't like loose ends. Your father knew too much, and they knew he knew. He was always looking over his shoulder, always waiting for the day they would come for him." Her brother stood abruptly, pacing the room. "This doesn't make sense. Dad he was just a regular guy. He wasn't some kind of criminal." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with pity. "I know it's hard to believe, but the man you knew, the man who raised you, was only one side of him. There was another side, a side he kept hidden from everyone, even from me." She felt a lump in her throat as she looked at Clara. Do you think that's why he died? Because of these people?" Clara's face crumpled and she nodded. "I don't know for sure, but yes, I think so. He was always so careful, so cautious. For something like this to happen, it doesn't feel like an accident." The room fell silent, the weight of Clara's words hanging heavy in the air. She felt like she was drowning, the truth pulling her under, suffocating her. Her father, her kind, loving father, had been living a double life, hiding secrets that could have gotten him killed. And now those secrets were threatening to tear her family apart. Her brother stopped pacing and turned to Clara, his voice low and urgent. "Do you have any proof? Anything that could help us figure out what really happened?" Clara hesitated, then stood and walked to a small desk in the corner of the room. She opened a drawer and pulled out a worn leather journal. "This was your father's," she said, handing it to him. "He kept it hidden, even from me. I found it after he died. I haven't read it, but I think it might have the answers you're looking for." Her brother took the journal, his hands trembling slightly. He opened it, flipping through the pages filled with their father's handwriting. She leaned in, her heart pounding as she saw notes, names, and dates, pieces of a puzzle they were only beginning to understand. "We need to read this," her brother said, his voice firm. "All of it. If there's even a chance it can tell us what happened to Dad, we have to know." She nodded, her resolve hardening. Whatever secrets their father had been keeping, whatever dangers he had been trying to protect them from, they were going to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it was. They sat in Clara's living room, the journal spread open on the coffee table between them. The pages were filled with their father's handwriting, neat, precise, and yet somehow frantic, as if he had been writing in a hurry, desperate to document everything before it was too late. The entries were dated, some going back years, and each one seemed to reveal a little more about the life he had been hiding. Her brother flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the words quickly. "This is unbelievable," he muttered, his voice tinged with disbelief. He was tracking people, transactions, meetings. It's like he was building a case against someone. She leaned closer, her heart racing as she read the entries. Names she didn't recognize, amounts of money that made her head spin, and cryptic notes about deals and consequences. It was like peering into a world she had never known existed, a world of shadows and danger. "Look at this," her brother said, pointing to a specific entry. "He mentions a man named Victor Kane, says he's the one pulling the strings. Whoever this guy is, Dad was terrified of him." She felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think this Victor Kane had something to do with Dad's death?" Her brother's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but it's possible. If Dad was trying to expose him, or if he knew too much, it wouldn't be the first time someone got killed for less." Clara, who had been sitting quietly, spoke up. "Your father mentioned that name once. Victor Kane. He said he was dangerous, that he had connections everywhere. He told me to stay away from him, no matter what." She looked at Clara, her mind racing. "Do you know where we can find him? This Victor Kane?" Clara shook her head. Your father never told me much about him, but if he's as powerful as your father said, he won't be easy to find." Her brother closed the journal, his expression grim. "We don't have a choice. We have to try. If this guy's responsible for Dad's death, we need to know. And if he's still out there, he could be a threat to us too." She felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. The idea of confronting someone like Victor Kane was terrifying, but her brother was right. They couldn't just walk away, not now, not when they were so close to the truth. "What do we do next?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Her brother thought for a moment, then stood. "We start with what we have. The names, the dates, the transactions. We piece it all together. If we can find a pattern, a connection, maybe we can figure out who this Victor Kane is and where to find him." Clara nodded. "Your father kept records of everything. If there's a clue, it's in that journal." They spent the next few hours poring over the journal, reading every entry, every note, every scribble in the margins. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, but they couldn't stop. Every word felt like a piece of the puzzle, and they were determined to put it all together. As the hours passed, a pattern began to emerge. Their father had been tracking a series of transactions, large sums of money moving between shell companies, offshore accounts, and anonymous beneficiaries. It was clear that he had been trying to follow the money, to trace it back to its source. "Look at this," her brother said, pointing to a series of entries. "He mentions a company called Blackthorn Holdings. It keeps coming up over and over. He thought it was a front for something bigger." She frowned. "Blackthorn Holdings? I've never heard of it." "Neither have I," her brother admitted. "But if Dad thought it was important, it's worth looking into." They decided to focus their efforts on Blackthorn Holdings. It was the only lead they had, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. Using their phones, they began searching for information about the company. But it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. The company had no online presence, no listed address, no contact information. It was as if it didn't exist. "This doesn't make sense," she said, frustration creeping into her voice. "How can a company just disappear?" Her brother sighed. "It's not disappearing. It's hiding. And if it's hiding, that means it's got something to hide." Clara, who had been watching them silently, spoke up. Your father used to say that the truth is like a shadow. It's always there, but you have to know where to look. Her brother looked at her, a spark of determination in his eyes. Then we'll keep looking. We'll find this company, and we'll find Victor Kane, no matter what it takes. She nodded, her resolve hardening. They were in too deep to turn back now. Whatever secrets their father had been keeping, whatever dangers he had been trying to protect them from, they were going to face them head on. The search for Blackthorn Holdings consumed them. Days turned into nights as they scoured the internet, made phone calls, and even reached out to old contacts of their fathers, hoping for a lead. But the company remained elusive, a ghost in the corporate world. It was as if it had been designed to vanish, leaving no trace behind. Frustration grew with each dead end. She could see the toll it was taking on her brother. His eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders tense. She wasn't faring much better. Sleep was fleeting, her mind racing with questions and fears. But they couldn't stop. Not now. One evening, as they sat in their father's office surrounded by stacks of papers and empty coffee cups, her brother let out a frustrated sigh. There's nothing. No records, no addresses, no employees. It's like this company doesn't exist. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Maybe we're going about this the wrong way. If Blackthorn is a front for something bigger, maybe we need to look at the people behind it. Dad mentioned Victor Kane in the journal. What if he's connected to Blackthorn? Her brother frowned, flipping through the journal again. There's a note here, Dad wrote. Kane controls the board. What does that mean? The board of what? She sat up straighter, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. What if it's the board of Blackthorn? Maybe Victor Kane is the one running the company, or at least pulling the strings. Her brother's eyes lit up. That could be it. If we can find Kane, we might be able to find Blackthorn. And if we find Blackthorn, we might finally get some answers. But finding Victor Kane was easier said than done. The name was common enough, and without more information, they were back to square one. They spent hours searching online, but every lead turned out to be a dead end. It was as if Victor Kane was just as invisible as Blackthorn Holdings. Just as they were about to give up for the night, her brother's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing. It's an email, he said, opening it, from an anonymous sender. She leaned in, her heart pounding. What does it say? He read the email aloud, his voice tense. If you're looking for Victor Kane, meet me at the old warehouse on 7th Street. Midnight. Come alone. She felt a chill run down her spine. Who sent that? How do they know we're looking for Kane? Her brother shook his head. I don't know, but it's the first real lead we've had. We can't ignore it. She hesitated, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. What if it's a trap? What if someone's trying to lure us in? Her brother looked at her, his expression grim. It could be, but we don't have a choice. If we want answers, we have to take the risk. She nodded, though her hands were trembling. Okay, but we're not going alone. We'll go together. Her brother agreed, and they spent the next few hours preparing. They didn't know what to expect, but they couldn't afford to walk into the situation blindly. They packed flashlights, their phones, and a small knife her brother had tucked into his pocket, just in case. As midnight approached, they drove to the old warehouse on 7th Street. It was a crumbling building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by chain-link fences and overgrown weeds. The place looked abandoned, but as they parked and thus stepped out of the car, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The warehouse door creaked open as they approached, and a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man, tall and wiry, with a hood pulled low over his face. He looked around nervously before gesturing for them to follow him inside. Her brother hesitated, glancing at her. Stay close, he whispered. They followed the man into the warehouse, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The man led them to a small room at the back of the warehouse, where another man was waiting. This man was older, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. He looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. So, he said, his voice low and gravelly, you're the ones looking for Victor Kane. Her brother stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. Who are you, and how do you know about Kane? The man smirked. Names aren't important. What's important is that you're in over your heads. Victor Kane isn't someone you want to mess with. She felt a surge of anger. Our father is dead. We think Kane had something to do with it. We deserve to know the truth. The man's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. Your father was a good man. He got caught up in something he couldn't control. Kane, he's dangerous. If you go after him, you're putting yourselves in his crosshairs. Her brother crossed his arms. We're not backing down. Tell us where to find him. The man sighed, shaking his head. You're as stubborn as your father. Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to her brother. This is the last known address for Kane, but be careful. He's not the kind of man who takes kindly to visitors. She took the paper, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The address was in another city, a place they would have to travel to. But it was a lead, a real lead. As they turned to leave, the man called after them. One more thing, if you do find Kane, don't trust him. He's a liar, a manipulator, and he'll do whatever it takes to protect his secrets. They nodded, their hearts heavy with the weight of his words. As they stepped back into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The address led them to a sleek, modern building in the heart of the city. It was a far cry from the crumbling warehouse they had visited the night before. The building exuded power and wealth, its glass facade reflecting the skyline like a mirror. Victor Kane, it seemed, was a man who liked to flaunt his success. They stood outside, staring up at the building, their nerves on edge. The man at the warehouse had warned them about Kane, but they had come too far to turn back now. They needed answers, and they were willing to face whatever dangers lay ahead to get them. Ready? Her brother asked, his voice low. She nodded, though her heart was pounding. Let's do this. They walked into the building, the lobby as opulent as the exterior. A security guard stopped them at the front desk, his expression stern. Can I help you? Her brother stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. We're here to see Victor Kane. The guard raised an eyebrow. Do you have an appointment? No, her brother admitted, but he'll want to see us. Tell him it's about James Carter. The guard hesitated, then picked up the phone and made a call. He spoke in low tones, his eyes flicking toward them as he listened to the response. After a moment, he hung up and gestured toward the elevators. Top floor. He's expecting you. They rode the elevator in silence, the tension thick between them. When the doors opened, they were greeted by a woman in a sharp suit, her expression unreadable. Mr. Kane will see you now, she said, leading them down a hallway to a set of double doors. She pushed the doors open, revealing a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Behind a large desk sat a man, Victor Kane. He was older than she had expected, with silver hair and sharp, piercing eyes. He looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and amusement, as if their presence was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. James Carter's children, he said, his voice smooth and controlled. I've been expecting you. She felt a chill run down her spine. You knew we were coming? Kane smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course. Your father was a complicated man. I knew it was only a matter of time before you came looking for answers. Her brother stepped forward, his voice hard. What did you do to him? Kane leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. I didn't do anything to your father. He made his own choices, choices that had consequences. What kind of choices? She demanded, her voice trembling with anger. Kane sighed as if explaining something to a child. Your father was involved in a business deal, a very lucrative business deal. But he got cold feet. He thought he could walk away, take what he knew and disappear. But in my line of work, there's no walking away. She felt her stomach twist. So you killed him? Kane's expression darkened. I didn't kill him, but I can't say I'm surprised by what happened. Your father knew the risks. He knew what he was getting into. Her brother clenched his fists, his voice rising. You're lying. You had something to do with his death, and we're going to prove it. Kane stood, his gaze cold and unyielding. I wouldn't recommend that. Your father's mistakes don't have to be yours. Walk away and I'll forget this little visit ever happened. Keep digging and you'll regret it. She felt a surge of defiance, stepping forward to meet his gaze. We're not afraid of you. We're going to find out the truth, no matter what it takes. Kane's lips curled into a smirk. Brave words, but bravery won't save you from the consequences. Your father learned that the hard way. The woman in the suit appeared at the door, her expression impassive. Mr. Kane has another meeting. It's time for you to leave. They were escorted out of the office, their minds reeling. As they stepped back into the elevator, she felt a mix of emotions, anger, fear, and a burning determination to see this through. We can't let him get away with this, her brother said, his voice low and fierce. We have to expose him. For Dad. She nodded, her resolve hardening. We will, but we need proof, something concrete that we can take to the authorities. They spent the next few days gathering evidence, using the information from their father's journal and the leads they had uncovered. It was risky, and they knew Kane was watching them, but they couldn't stop. They were too close. Finally, they had enough. Bank records, emails, and documents that linked Kane to illegal activities. They took it all to the police, who launched an investigation. It was a long, grueling process, but in the end, Victor Kane was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The trial was a media sensation, and the truth about their father's death finally came to light. Kane had ordered the hit, fearing that their father would expose him. It was a bitter victory, but it was justice. As they stood outside the courthouse after the verdict, she felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a sense of closure. Their father's secrets had been laid bare, but his legacy was one of love and sacrifice. He had tried to protect them, even in death. Her brother put an arm around her shoulders, his voice soft. He'd be proud of us, you know. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I know. They walked away from the courthouse, the weight of the past finally lifting. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they had each other. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.